Hey guys, it's Philip here, Philip Bergeron. I wrote a book called The 12th Stone, and this is the audiobook of that story that I wrote. This is my second attempt to do this here. The first one I tried to do in GarageBand, and because I have a plan to make something really cool that sounds really good, but that didn't work on my first attempt here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna kind of sit here while it records, just in the voice memo on my phone. And I apologize, guys, that the audio quality is so bad here. I'm trying the best I can. I will get something better to you, I promise, as soon as I'm able to. But this is just the read aloud function on Microsoft Word. So I've got my guitar here. So my idea was originally to, I wanted to have like a center track of the audio recording, and then I want to have really pretty music going on through really the entirety of it. So since I can't make that happen in GarageBand right now, and I think I'm going to need to get like Logic or something. I don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sit here, and I'm going to press play on the read aloud function on Word. And she's going to read to you, and I am going to play guitar while she reads to you. So I hope that you enjoy both of us. And I'm sorry that I'm fat, and you're probably going to hear my breathing throughout this. Please, guys, just shut up. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so I'm gonna press play. I hope you guys enjoy this. It's probably gonna be kind of long. Forgive me, but at the same time, like, I hope you guys have a lot of fun. I'm gonna try to have fun. I wasn't expecting to have to sit here and have to. I was expecting to play guitar and like listen and do this the whole time, but we're gonna do it together, and I think it's gonna be fun. So this is the 12th Stone.
Preface. Hello everyone. My name is Philip, and I live in Fort Worth with my wonderful wife of sunshine, Kaylee, our mystery-solving lab Lavender, and the ever-bumbling and constantly spliffing Mr. Bean. Our world is small, but for over a decade I've had an idea for a story set in a world that is much bigger than mine. A world of magic and dragons, but also a world broken by the wills of those who control its most powerful nation. Over time, this story has taken on several different forms, but the core of what I set out to write down has remained consistent throughout. I hope that you enjoy Ren's story as much as I do, and thank you so much for reading this and supporting Kaylee and me. Several years ago, my wife and I looked at each other and had a conversation about going back to church. At the time, we both lived a life of intense vice and sin, reveling in the debauchery of it and shamelessly professing our hatred of the very concept of God. When we went to church for the first time again, I was mainly excited to get to play my guitar again with my family, who are a large part of the band at what is now our home church. We went for several months, and decided that it had become an important enough thing in our lives to get publicly baptized and start saying that, hey, we're with the big guy now too. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I actually felt it. I am telling you now, as a former devout and outspoken atheist, that there is a God, and he is sovereign and holy, suzerain over all that is and ever was and ever will be. And all that God wants to do is share his grace with those who show their fealty to his eternal kingdom, built on the faith of those who share his gospel. To follow Christ is a shedding of the ego and pride that keep you focused on this world and realize a basic truth that cannot be avoided, a scientific fact: something cannot be created from nothing. Intelligent design is present in every component of our conceivable universe, and the only answer that science has about it is that it doesn't know either. The Bible is just a book if you let it be, too. But when you absorb its meaning and enact its messages, you will be left with the same conclusion I came to, and that so many with hardened hearts throughout his reign have come to know as well, that the mystery, the faith, that's what hope is. And hope, that's what love is made of. And I serve a mighty God, who is your eternal King despite acknowledgement, whose word is true despite the logic you can weave, jealous because he is only, and that being is made of love. I am fully aware, and you need to be as well, dear reader, that a lot of the following is very, 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 and I cannot overstate this, very gross. This is a mature story intended for a mature audience. It is extremely dark, and the content is heavy, some might say needlessly so, though I would very much disagree. This story deals in themes like trauma, abuse, addiction, and a struggle to find one's sense of self. If you are easily unsettled, triggered, or not in the proper headspace to take in themes such as those, I would strongly advise that you do not read this story, and please, I beg you, turn back and think of me like the person the above paragraphs illustrate. If it makes you uncomfortable to read, trust me when I say that I had a hard time writing it too. Please remember that this is just a rough draft, me throwing mud at the wall to see what sticks, and I am very much looking for notes. What Ren is going through in his journey is a struggle that so many people my age face. I lost my dad at a young age, and that led me on a path away from God, unknown to me at the time that he was weaving a tapestry that was only ugly from the side I was looking on. And it's still ugly on my side, from my perspective. That came through in Guldara, I think, and you'll see what I mean. Sorry Nana, I know it's nasty, and I know she's clutching her pearls and saying, Lord help him, that boy isn't right. Ren starts his journey where I was just before I was saved, shameless, and selfish and alone, because of his choices. We are going to watch him learn how to handle what comes next together, because I don't know either. I'm making it up as I go along. Again, I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Please feel free to enjoy the content, and if you desire to donate, it is much appreciated. And tithed. God bless you all. P.K. Bergeron. The 12th Stone, Act 1. Written by P.K. Bergeron. Edited by K.M. Bergeron. To my love, my life, and my God. He is sovereign above all else. Chapter 1. Come on Dre, the pup alone is worth at least 3 times that. Ren pressed into the thick hide where it left an impression of his right thumb, took a knife from the counter and scraped the sharp of the blade against the grain, making a sound like ripping paper against the 2.5-inch thick dire wolf pup skin. He stabbed the knife back into the counter, wincing from the reverberation it made on his body and agitating the wound festering on his other hand. Every now and then the bite mark would ooze a bit more blood, leaving drops on the floor of the market, the edges of the bite itself beginning to turn a sickly yellow. Ain't none under a great green growth who's puttin' up more'n 15 stone for a measly dire wolfskin what ain't even grown, and, whar these, rabbit pelts? You're selling me your dinner now, that it? Think ye can do, and take as ye please, bleed on me rug. He spat on the floor and eyed the boy up and down, looks like some mold don't clean, no matter how much you scrape. Man's gotta eat, Dre. No, man's gorna stop bleeding on my flogging rug. It's 15 stone for the dire pup, and I'll give, he picked through the bloodied and hastily skinned pelts, I'll give you 2 pebbles fair each of the rabbits. That's 20 stone, and more'n you deserve. Those rabbits were vicious, Dre, nigh on to becoming dire themselves. Proactive culling should be at least worth a stone each, agreed? I'm not giving ye 10 flogging stone fair rabbit pelts, boy. Do ye see a flogging hunters guild mark angin above my door? No? No. You're out of your mind. 3 pebbles each then. You're lucky I'm taking them at all. What am I gonna do with them? The shopkeeper picked up the cut of dire leather once again and examined it closely. He let out a sigh. Look kid, I'll give you 20 stone fair the pup, and I'll take the lot of pelts fair 5. That's enough to get you squared away with Doc. Ooh, I'm sure you owe well above by any right. Ye can get plenty of food in ya. Heck, maybe even a room fair a month or 2. Gorta be an all around here, someone won't mind you crawling into. You toss a ruby their way. Might do you some good to sleep under a roof. He looked into Wren's bloodshot and wired eyes. Or sleep at all, I reckon. Wren's eye twitched, and he ran his fingers through his oily black hair with his uninjured hand, and took in a deep breath through his nose. He blinked, and his eyes burned and bathed in that glorious juice the haste had derived them from, if only for a moment. When he opened his eyes, they narrowed and met with the shopkeeper's, and he said, "25 for the pup, then?" The shopkeeper shook his head and scrunched his nose, a thinly veiled anger on the tip of his tongue. He pulled the skins behind the counter and went into the back office, a flash of orange emanating from within, emerging a few moments later with a small leather satchel that he dropped onto the counter with a soft clink, still furry and still bloody. "There's 20 stone in that bag. Get some rest, kid. And get out." It wasn't food that Wren needed, of course. And it wasn't sleep, 3 days without now, and still wide and awake. What he needed was sweet Demarian haste. He had enough money to stock up for at least a month. No Molly's to accuse him of stealing her jewelry, which he still didn't seem to feel much remorse for. What little remorse he did have he had taken out on his room before he left, while she was at work, so he could leave and have her know how hurt he was without ever needing to say a word. He whipped down an alleyway, checking behind his shoulder to see that no one was watching him, and locked eyes with an old woman staring out her clay window. Wren stopped and stared back, only realizing after several seconds that she was blind, or a mannequin. Either way, she wasn't looking at him so much as looking at nothing at all. He made his way down the alley, and at the end of it peeked his head over the side of the walkway to see if anyone was underneath him. He leaped over the railing to the lower level, trying to catch himself as he landed, and for a moment, forgetting the horrid pain seeping into his fingers from the hot bite on his hand, numb and less agitated, and screamed a swear word as the bite ripped open and fresh blood sparkled against the old and dried. A man stuck his head out of a window and screamed for him to keep it down. They had just gotten their baby to sleep. Wren grimaced and forced a smile, waving and apologizing to the man and others who had stuck their heads out, as well. A few buildings down, and he entered another alleyway, taking an instant, sharp left into an entry hole carved out of the stone edifice of the Demarian wall. The building reeked of honeyweed and stronger smells, like burning sulfur, but sharper to breathe in, smells that burnt his lungs and caused him to cough and left a mysterious haze throughout the entire complex. Delinquents laughed and snickered as he walked past them up the stairway, mockingly asking if his hand was bothering him at all. He could hear their continued mocking and laughing until he entered another long hallway lined with apartments, several flights up, high enough from the window in the stairwell to be able to see Doc's House of Healing. When he got to the door, he knocked with his good hand, and the door instantly opened, a tall and slender man with sunken cheeks and blackened eyes standing in silence. "Tell Mikey, I want to go fast." The man's black eyes stared back into his, and he nodded his head in a gesture for him to pass. The room was filled with honeyweed smoke being funneled out of maybe a dozen different mouths, dead black eyes looking into his, the walls lined with grotesque and graphic artwork at the same time violent and pornographic. Wren felt queasy as he wiped sweat from his brow. "'Bout time you show up again, Rooster. I was worried you might be going without." Mikey was tattooing a swear word onto the forehead of one of his goons, who was passed out on the chair. Hopefully just passed out, Wren thought, but he had known Mikey a long time and you could never tell with him. Wren forced a smirk and wiped the sweat already pooling back onto his forehead, his face feeling cold. "I was just here a couple weeks ago, Mikey. Got bit pretty bad and the damn beast trashed my stash." Mikey peeked his head up and pushed his tinted glasses down his nose, looking at Wren with the same blackened eyes the rest of his goons were sporting, and glanced down at his bleeding hand. "Sorry kid, no refunds. But I'll happily supply the needy." He snapped his finger, and one of the goons went into another room, emerging seconds later, with several vials of haste. "How much you need, Rooster?" Wren pulled out the bag of stones he got from the merchant and tossed it to him. Mikey turned the bag over and the stones fell into his hand, holding a few of them up to the light to check their color. He bit into one of them and it made a clink against his teeth, and he smiled and held up 3 fingers to the goon with the vials, and the goon thrusted 3 vials of haste into Ren's hand. New stuff, too. Try some. Ren was trying to catch his breath, his knees weak. Now? I'm bleeding pretty bad here, Mikey. Oh, come on, Rooster, live a little. Old man Rooster would want that, you ask me. Ren took in a deep breath and opened the top of the draft, instantly smelling its thick scent, and downed a gulp of the haste. His eyes popped wide, and the color came back into his face for just a moment, until his hand began profusely bleeding and spurting blood across the room. Mikey screamed for his goons to get him to the healer. If I lose pay this steady, I'm taking what he spends in a week out of each of your pockets. They dropped him at the entrance from the back of their cart and raced off from the healing house. He stumbled in and collapsed right as he made it past the threshold. When he awoke, his hand had been bandaged. The room was white and sterile, the walls lined with paintings of animals doing extreme sports, each with its own inspirational slogan like "Hang in there" and "Almost Friday." Next to him was a metal tray, on top of which were various enchanted medical implements. "Ah, awake at last," said Doc, one of the few surviving Yuan left on all of Calta, who smelled like mint with a beard twisted into multiple sets of beaded braids that went down to his navel. He at first appeared to be rather short in stature, no more than a meter tall, but within seconds he was towering above the bed at 2.5 meters, while he checked nearly 3 dozen vital spots on Ren's body. Then, he was back down to his original size, taking notes about what he saw. "How are we feeling there, kiddo? On a scale from 1 to 10? He turned in his invisible swivel chair and kicked his legs back, crossing them on an invisible stool. Ren squinted through the bright lights to the doctor, who was stretching only his torso every few seconds to check another area on Ren's body, and returning to his desk to scribble notes. Well, what would one be? Doc furrowed his brow and pushed out his bottom lip, making a face like a duck while he said, "For convenience's sake we'll say 1 is I can hardly tell a very big wolf tore through 4 tendons, and 10 is oh dear digalma, I can still feel its fangs, end it now, end it now." Ren gripped his hand and winced, thought for a moment, then said, 2. The doctor clapped his hands together and then pumped a hand in the air, "And you came here with nearly a quarter of blood gone. Not bad for an ancient hack going on there, what, 1200? If I do say so." He pulled at the collar of his robe, and Ren met his smile with one of his own. "You're lucky it's just me here," Doc continued. "If Molly had decided to," he chuckled to himself, "show up, unannounced, and saw you lying here on my table passed out, you'd have gotten the wrap-up treatment and, then, a stern talking to. Figures. 2 weeks, kid. That's too long out there. I got sidetracked." "Where? In Leicester?" "Ugh, no." "Then where?" He didn't respond. His eyes were so heavy. The haste was wearing off, or Doc purged him of it, and the come-down was rearing its ugly head. "How long was I out?" "About half an hour." "Where did you get sidetracked?" "Definitely purged." Ren's nostrils flared. "Has Molly seen me?" "No, she's off on Wednesdays, you know that." Or, "Oh, you don't know what day it is." "Of course, you don't. Where have you been, Ren?" "The woods." "You got a death wish?" "Man's gotta eat. And your mom doesn't want to bury her son. Don't make her do that. Don't do this to her. To yourself. To us. You scared us, son." Ren lifted himself from the table and turned to walk out the door. "You going home? To see her?" Ren didn't respond. He walked into the lobby and out into the street. He reached into his back pocket and pulled a clinking vial of haste from it, giving it a shake. it sloshed inside. He pulled his head back and took a swig, releasing a caustic onslaught onto his tongue that was overwhelmingly tangy and bitter and sweet. The road before him instantly came into focus and sharpened at the edges of his vision. He looked back, and at the window Doc looked back at him with eyes Ren was tired of seeing. Eyes of pity. By the time he had turned onto his street, the windowing of familiar houses twinkling and dancing with lives inside, Ren was grinding his teeth and taking in deep enough breaths to fill the hollow feeling in his chest. He wanted to run out of Damar. He wanted to be anywhere but here. It was the house that he grew up in, but it was someone else's memory that he was looking in on. Good times that someone else had, and he somehow remembers, like looking at a familiar scene through thick fog. Someone who died in its walls, or on a gurney in Doc's office, gasping for breath. It didn't matter to the house. Tainted over time with fresher hells and wilting flowers. A new door, the old one in splinters somewhere out of sight but never far out of mind. Back then, he didn't call her Molly. "I'm here, Mom. I'm not going anywhere." She's crying again, and he's old enough to know how bad it hurts, but not old enough to do anything about it. Or he could, but he doesn't know how. He doesn't know he's lying at the time, but she does. She knows impossibly more than he does, more than he can even fathom and ever will. In the years to come, she would tell him this often. The new door was heavier opening than he was used to, and made an involuntary slam when it shut, and he instantly winced. She ran around the corner with her spatula lifted in one hand and a lit honeyweed cigarette in the other. When their eyes met, her eyebrows raised and she placed the cigarette to her lips, taking a short drag. "Don't slam the door," she said through the smoke. Ren takes a sip of his coffee and pulls from his cigarette at the same table that his dad, who hated the smell of the smoke, would sit at for hours every day. An acquired scent that he never acquired, he would have probably said. The repurposed four-person card table was against the wall and covered with mail and papers, all hastily pushed back to make room for him to sit. The table hadn't been used in years. She was making him feel like he's important enough to make room on the table she covered in filth. And soon, he wasn't sure when, she would take that important feeling from him. He was under her roof, and under her whim. "So, are you back?" Her voice was lightning bolts streaking across shattering glass. She wasn't looking at him, invested more in her cooking. It smelled like nostalgia, corrupted by the wine on her breath even from across the room. "If I can be, I guess." He put out his cigarette and crossed his arms. "You guess? You're either here or you're not." "Then yeah, for now." "No, you're either here or you're not. I'll say it until it sticks if that's what you need." "Then I'm here. For now." She sniffs and wrinkles her nose, ashing her cigarette into the sink. She puts a bowl of food down in front of him, then takes a bowl for herself into her office, sliding the door closed behind her. His room was just as he left it. Remnants of war, before he left and said that she was just as dead to him, just because he knew how bad it would hurt her to hear him say it. The bed was pulled about a foot from the wall and completely disheveled, sheets wrinkled and possibly torn. The drawers of his armoire were all pulled out, their contents emptied onto the floor. An acrid smell came from the other side of his bed, where a collected pile of sullied plates and cups had begun to mold over. The closet door was ripped off and laying over a mound of clothes. The closet itself was stacked tall with more clothes still, out for the world to see with the door ripped from its hinges, hidden once, but now in the light. He sits on the foot of his bed and looks up, to the top of the armoire. A picture of his dad looks back at him, always smiling, even if the man himself hardly ever did. He laid back on the bed and let its familiarity hug him. He wouldn't cry. Not here. This room had seen enough of that. Behind his closed eyes, the haste coursing through his veins caused fireworks and lightning to shoot across the black. He counted the explosions, and they sang him a song, a lullaby for him alone. It hummed him to sleep, 3 days of unblinking withdrawals finally catching up to his body. It is now that I must admit that I was furious to be back in this cesspool of an underbelly the mortals call Damar. The haste keeps him awake, and there he feels safe from what he knows I am, or thinks I am, or hopes I am, but in his dreams he cannot hide from me, and so, in my fury, I show him living in the woods with his mom, the UN doctor strapped to a feeding chair like his worthless father was when he was alive and too sick to function on his own. They're sitting at the table eating dinner. The smell of nostalgia. Ren isn't eating, the medicine he learned to take keeping his hunger at bay, nauseating to think of putting food into his mouth and letting it fall into the muck, where his magus pulsates and throbs and aches in perpetuity, until he crawls to the rotting hull himself or until I make him more than death can touch. Molly is picking up globs of slop and feeding them to Doc, who is letting the food fall back down onto his chest from an open maw. One eye is staring somewhere else, the other following Ren's gaze. You know, I've been warning you for long enough that you've spent all of it that I had to spare, she says. She is shoveling food into Doc's mouth faster. He is choking and taking gasping breaths. The walls breathe and shudder with his own breathing, containing memories that he ebbs and flows into and out of like a thick fog passing by. He feels a burning sensation radiating from his stomach and lifts his shirt to see his magus pulsating and glowing a pale blue light. The pain becomes so intense that he falls to his knees, screaming as he involuntarily pulls mana from the air, the very air around him burning from the radiant energy, and the earth bending and breaking under his infinitely increasing weight. He opens his eyes wide and looks to the sky, and Digalma the suzerain moon looks back at him with her single glowing silver pupil, undulating with delight. Blood pools from his ears and his mouth gapes from pain, and his magus erupts in a flash of blues, purples, and reds, settling into crimson blood when it touches the ground. He waits for the smoke to clear, and looks down to see his open chest, a still beating heart pumping hard before it stops abruptly, and he jolted awake. He grabbed at his stomach and felt his magus, the tumor barely making a protrusion against his flesh. Sweat poured into his eyes and drenched his shirt. The pale of night seeped in through his window. I apologize, Ren, for what it's worth. He walked into the kitchen, quietly grabbing loaves of bread and preserved meat from the pantry and placing them into his pack. He shut the front door behind him, and as soon as he stepped outside, he smelled tobacco burning in the air. Called it, said Doc, pulling from his cigar that looked oversized in his tiny hands. Well, Molly called it. I was hoping you wouldn't. Ren didn't respond, but pulled the straps on his pack tighter. If you leave like this again, she won't forgive you. You know that, right? Ren curled up a corner of his mouth. He walked over to Doc and took the cigar from him, taking a long drag from it before he handed it back. He scrunched his nose and looked up to the enchanted ceiling of Damar, translucently showing the night sky and Digalma's shining closed eye hanging in the ether. I found a free ride up, but the elf who works the lift is barely hanging on. Gonna be a long ride. Doc shook his head. I'll tell Molly you said you love her. Ren didn't look back, but he felt Doc's eyes at the back of his head. The lift was just outside of the settlement, left behind from an abandoned excavation. The elf had worked the lift long before that. He sat on the floor of the lift, and the elf nodded its head slowly up and down and raised its long stick-like arm and caressed a glowing blue orb. The lift jerked upward, creaking and moaning as the elf caressed the orb. Ren leaned over the side of the lift as it rose above even the tallest earthen homes. Higher up, and he saw the whole of the city stretching across the underground like an ocean of earthen buildings, layers and layers thick, hundreds of lifts strewn across its enormous ceiling that themselves led up to miles of nothing until it met with the top, where true light shone and that made a mockery of the faux magic ceiling. The ceiling stretched further than the eye could see, and from this high he could make out further settlements in Damar built into the cave walls and splattered across the underbelly. In the distance, the college spire loomed like a great beast, ever sleeping and impenetrable to any not born in its belly, penetrating the ceiling and stretching far into the sky above. He unsheathes me from my scabbard, and I too see Damar fall into the earth and out of our lives forever, I hope. I feel her light gleam against my blade and feel Ren's grip tighten around my handle before he sheaths me back into my scabbard. He waves his way through mites feeding on the remnants of mana in the dire beast blood. The wolf pup had attacked just as he had finished setting up his camp for the night, and it was still mostly intact, if not entirely disheveled. He spends a bit setting his tent, then with great effort sliced a small tree down with his magic, causing him to vomit and hold his stomach in pain. When his stomach settles, he makes a few quick slices randomly on the log, creating firewood. He manages to keep himself from vomiting. He pulls me from my sheath, and he begins to carve at a chunk of wood after he starts a fire using matches. After some time, he stabs the wood into the ground in front of the mana mites, and the rune that he carved into its face burns as the stave makes contact with the ground, warding the area of not only the mana mites hovering about, but also pulls out several spiders and various insects, and even a snake, all venomous, tossing them away from the area and barring them from entering the faint earthy glow of the ward. From the outside, his 5-meter ward looked like a mess of bushes and trees, the flames of his fire licking the air and becoming wind wisping through the leaves, leaving no trace of light from its inside, expertly camouflaged into the forest around him. Inside his father's wards was Ren's favorite place, invisible to the outside world, of course, but what he truly loved was the silence inside. He picked up a twig in his hand and snapped it, making a sound like hearing a bubble surface from underwater. Suddenly, 2 figures sprint past him and stop at a tree nearby, to catch their breath as they frantically search behind them. One is a younger female, probably around his age, the other slightly older with a fancy and well-trimmed twirled mustache. They say something to each other, and carefully survey the area around them in search of something that they were no doubt running from, something that Ren just realized could find them at any moment and lead whatever is chasing them right to him. Ren rushes up and sticks his head outside the ward, right in front of the face of the girl, who jumped and let out a yelp. He reached out and quickly pulled them both into the ward. The man jumped up from the ground and pulled a blade on Ren, who pulled me out of my scabbard to defend himself, but the girl put her arm on his and tried to scream wait. Both of them suddenly realizing that they were only emitting muffled sounds. They looked around them at the camp Ren had set up, and he held out a hand to show that he was no foe, points his finger toward the ward he had just placed down, and after a moment the confused pair silently thanked him. The man looks to the girl and Ren sees that he asks if she's okay, to which she nods her head and asks the same of him. After wincing his eyes, he lifts his shirt and a fresh wound seeped its way down his ribs, deep enough to show bone. Someone had cut him, no doubt, with a well-kept blade. The girl starts crying and he mouths that he's fine, and that it looks worse than it is. She pulls out a small kit filled with what looked like adhesive strips and sewing kit, and she starts sewing the man's wound closed with a needle and thread. Ren reaches out and stops her with a look of utter horror on his face and waves her away, placing his hand on the young man's side. In a flash of blue light, the wound was instantly healed. Ren immediately turned his head and silently retched until chunks of vomit finally surfaced. The light of several torches illuminates the forest and menacing shadows dance in their hunt behind it. The 3 in the ward stay still and calm and watch as, just outside the ward, for a lightly armored brigand stalk in apt alert, wielding blades inscribed with runes that gave them a faint glow of unmistakable heat. Enchanted weapons. A mockery of my perfect form. I seethed and whispered a plead into the boy's ear to cut and know them. For a moment, I thought he might have heard me. These were no mere bandits, these were mercenaries. Ren must have wondered in that moment who these 2 were that could inspire such a retinue, but in the next moment, the mustached man next to Ren used his dagger to slice into his own hand, and 2 huge drops of blood were sent zipping through the air, so fast that 2 of the bandits instantly fell from fresh holes made in their heads, a quiet pink mist left in their places. At the same moment, the girl rushed out of the ward at the 2 men turning to see their comrades falling dead and placed her palm against the back of one of them, letting out a burst of energy that sent the man flying into a tree and snapping his neck from the impact. The last remaining bandit lunged at the girl with his spear, which she deflects with another burst of magic, pushing the blade back, and another shot of blood rushes toward the bandit, who whips the blade to stop the projectile, parrying it to the side and hitting a tree that ruptures and erupts in wood and bark. A colony of fairies that had nested in the tree erupted out in a powder of pink and purple mist, and a swarm of them fume from the hole made in the tree. In all, it was no more than maybe 3 seconds, but Ren's eyes grew wide, knowing what would come next as the ward began to violently hum and vibrate. He bolted out of the ward to hear the horrible screeching of the fairies, and in the next moment a roar rang through the forest over the screeching. As Ren runs in vain, knowing that death is coming, he hears the bandit scream at the girl and mustached man that they're responsible for this, before the girl sends out another burst of energy, and the bandit's head simply vanishes in a spray of red and pink gore. Ren screams at the pair to run, and they turn to sprint just as the trees behind them burst forth from the monster charging through the forest to defend the fairies. The Lurbuck, an elemental sentinel, is over 3 meters tall and made of muscle and bark, with arms that carry it along the ground at destructive speeds as 2 tiny legs dangle underneath, its vital areas covered in a natural and impenetrable exoskeleton. It roars, swipes, and rushes after them, dozing down trees to get to the 3 as they run for their lives from the monster. It slams its fists into the ground and catapults itself into the air at incredible speed, the 3 watching as it flies overhead and lands away in front of them, cutting off what little path they had. The girl screams for the 2 young men to get behind her, and a rush of energy flows from her hands in a steady stream at the Lurbuck, who used its massive hands to shield itself from the invisible force as it struggled and raged to reach them. The girl screamed as the forest pulsed with energy, and the Lurbuck lifted its great hand again and slammed it into the earth. The ground cracked and split around them all, and they fell into darkness. Ren awakens to see the Lurbuck mostly crushed and splattered next to him, the creature's skull-like head pouring a steady stream of chunky purple viscera, its empty sockets staring into his as he realizes what he's looking at. He pushes himself back and swears, his head throbbing, and he reaches up and pulls back bloody fingers from a gash in his head made from the fall. The girl's voice appeared from behind him, apologizing for the rough landing. Ren looked up to see suzerain moonlight peeking through the hole left by the Lurbuck, maybe 300 meters up, barely specking the black earth above with moonlight. Ren remarks that they must have fallen into an old mine, but the mustached man says no, and then points behind them to see dimly lit statues leading up a staircase, high up to a temple of Lugal, god of the night and the endless ether, sworn enemy of the suzerain moon. A stained glass window hanging above shone purples and greens of moonlight glinting across the statues like waves seen from underneath. The girl, obviously tired and still catching her breath, says that she needs to rest before she can lift them up to the surface, but assures them both that she probably, definitely, can do it once she's rested a bit. The man agrees and thanks Ren for his help, shaking his hand and introducing himself as Sim and the girl as Bria. Ren introduces himself as well, then Sim points to the bleeding gash on Ren's head and asks him if he can use that healing magic from earlier to fix that on himself. Ren shakes his head, no, I never learned how. I've seen people do it before though. After a moment of awkward silence, the only sound being Bria's labored breathing, Ren asks if the 2 are from the college, to which they hesitantly reply that yes, they are. Ren says that he always wondered if there were really people in there, which Sim and Bria find amusing. Ren says that they can't stay here, as these old abandoned shafts can be home to worse things than creepers and crawlers that Sim seems to be extravagantly disgusted by as they scuttled underfoot, and says that they should be fine to rest in the temple, abandoned or not. The Yuan who carved the runes at these old temples like this one were able to ward against anything unholy. Sim and Bria exchange a look at that statement. Yuan runes don't wear out, either. We'll be safe in there. Ren and Sim help Bria up to her feet and the 3 make their way up the long and winding staircase to the temple. Ren and Sim press their body weight against the temple door, stuck somehow but unable to rust in the holy ward, and after a moment of pushing and grunting, the door buckles open. The trio is hit with the putrid smell of rotting flesh, before looking up to see that just at the entrance is a pile of corpses, maybe 15 to 20 in number, of varying age and gender. The word carved just into the stone edifice at the entrance was slashed through, letting flies and worse to nibble and gnaw at the carrion feast. Ren stifles himself from vomiting, but Sim pragmatically scans the room for danger with his dagger pressed firmly against his palm, and tells Ren and Bria. Look. The altar. At the pulpit stands an obscenely fat man with an enormous raven black beard, his hands gripped firmly at the raised edges of the platform. From where they stood, he appeared to be giving a sermon to the corpses. He stares the three of them down, then yells, "Please, make more noise if you can. Not a peep in an age, and suddenly you three parade around like you're about to miss your chance to make any more racket." Sim asks him who he is, and he says, "I'll tell you anything you want, Twirly, just find a way to get me off this flogging thing." They ask what he means, and he very frustratedly tells them to come closer, and when they do they see that the man's hands are stuck to the stand with a thick layer of dried adhesive. The man looks at Ren, then the man looks at me and asks, "Bless her many bushes, is that a Yuan weapon?" To which the boy stupidly answers that I indeed am. The man sighs in relief, "Perfect. Cut my hands off and get me the hell out of here." Chapter 2. Guldara begins her day like any other, checking her traps and humming "Oh Lily" as best she can, with her ripped and shredded vocal cords. The first trap, too far to be useful, is covered in beetles that have found themselves stuck on the post. She is disgusted by the bugs and sets the post aflame, looks around to find another spot and forms another post from wood and earth, singeing the inside of it hot to make a molten iron core. She was always disappointed by the location of this trap, and the thought crosses her mind to find a new spot. The same thought had crossed her mind the day before. And the day before that. And the day before that. The trek to the second trap was long and uphill, but was the closest by far to what anyone here would consider civilization. A colony of dire vermin had settled nearby, and constructed a holler, complete with a temple to Singal they adorn with a fresh orange daily, and a shop where they barter and trade using insects as currency. She found little need to visit, and found their auras to be just as malevolent and blood-red as any elfin she had ever seen. Auras of greed, of lies, and darker things still that the same keep hidden in a place that only the aura can penetrate to see, and feeds on it to become more than just greed and lies. Auras like his was. By the time she reached the second trap, her face was red and her knuckles white, nails digging into each palm hard enough to break skin. And then, the anger that Guldara felt as her second trap lay barren was boundless. She balled her fist so hard that her knuckles cracked, and blood dripped onto the hungry earth. Her mages pulsed on the back of her neck, searing a white-hot heat throughout her entire body, and the ground around her sat on edge at her command. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3. The third trap was southeast of the second, near an abandoned fishery left over from elfin civilization, when this forest was a flood of water. It had been years since she had been inside the building, of course, but imagine the scene that she left there would be just as beautiful as the day she left it. The thought excited her, but she dared not enter. Such depravity can only breed curses, and why would she deprive her kin of house and home? This place held a special meaning for her, a lifetime ago. Here in the Badlands, the great forest of the Meccan woods, she found somewhere safe, far enough that no one would come looking, but close enough to civilization that the odd interaction she shared with dwellers and wanderers had kept her mind from completely drifting into madness. She remembered each of them fondly and carried with her a piece of them. She felt in her pocket and fidgeted with one of them now, a finger preserved in a thin layer of her adhesive magic so that she could still feel every imperfection and wrinkle. She knew it now as well as its owner once had, or maybe even still does as her spirit weeps somewhere in the ether, and its familiarity calmed her, and the memory of suffering filled her with a quiet resolve. As she approached the fishery she heard movement, muffled by the dense forest, but she still could make out the rustling of leaves and muffled voices. She bit her bottom lip and crouched down, approaching the edge of the fishery and peeking around the corner. Two men, poachers by the look of it, wearing hand-knit trapper's garb, had found her trap, and one of them had stuck his hand into the gooey mess of adhesive she had slathered on the gate post. A small red string was hoisted to a makeshift mechanism on the post itself, and the tiny noose had snared around the wrist of the stuck man. The other man was trying to carve away at the wood around the adhesive with a dull kitchen knife, but the adhesive had gotten between his fingers and on the blade itself, sticking more with every awkward stab into the post. The handle seemed to be stuck against his palm in such a position that he could barely hold it upright at all. "Just yank it out, Larg. We'll get you to a healer and patched right up, okay? It's cuttin' off me circulation, Geordie. It's gonna rip me and off, and they can't ill me anew, and, can they? Just hold fast, won't be long now, if I can get a grip on this damned knife. Stop corving at a top where the goo is, ye moron. Corv at a bottom, and I'll carry de flogging thing terms down." The pair argued, and Guldara watched, stroking the finger in her pocket. The trap wouldn't cut off circulation entirely, but his hand was stuck until she made him unstuck, and a sense of pride welled within her from this thought, then another when she remembered that even when he gets through the wood, no iron blade is getting through that core. As she smiled, an idea crossed her mind, and a jolt of joy ran throughout her being. She closed her eyes and concentrated, feeling the mana within her becoming her very skin. She touched the face, the same one she stole from the girl who was so pretty to see. She looked at her hands, the same hands she had when she was a girl, before he took her. She began to cry at the thought, louder than she meant to. The voices stopped and stopped moving, and Guldara sheepishly came around the corner into their view. "Dear Dig Alma, Geordie, was a lil girl doing alone ower?" said the man stuck to the post. "Stay back, lil one," he yelled to Guldara. "There's some sorta magic muck air that's gora bind on us both, steer clear." She sniffled and wiped at her snot with the sleeve of her jacket, taking small and awkward stumbling steps towards them with her new feet. She was now close enough to the pair to smell them, and they had been in this wood for quite some time. The one trapped by her magic had soiled himself. From this distance, a shot of her magic could be applied anywhere to either of the men, and so she pondered for a moment about which one would be more fun. She lifted her finger towards the mouth of the man with the knife, and with a spark her magus flared a bright green hue, and a shot of adhesive flew from her fingertips and covered both the mouth and nose of the man with the knife. The force instantly knocked him back, and he used his free hand to try to wipe the adhesive from his nose and mouth, covering it in the gunk until it too was stuck to his face. His body convulsed and writhed in a struggle to find a breath, but the thick adhesive would let none through. Guldara stood over him and watched his eyes fade with a vacant stare. Then he stopped moving and his body instead began to twitch, his eyes turning a sickening shade of yellow as they rolled to the back of his skull. Guldara turned to the stuck man, the magic melting off of her face, revealing her scars and sunken features and too crooked nose as it dripped onto the forest floor like rotted sloughing flesh. She asked if his name was Larg, if she had heard that right, and the man nodded his head as tears flowed down his face. Guldara squatted down next to him and kissed him deeply, a trail of thick saliva in his mouth, turning ever thicker as she planted more kisses on his head. She said, "You're my pet now, Larg. I'm going to be your new mama." His mouth glued stuck, he tried to scream, and she laughed, inches from his face before telling him to stay put, and she'd be back later to bring him to his new home. Her heart fluttered as she walked away. She was in love. As Guldara skipped and smiled to the location of her final trap, she heard a faint squeal, and her heart skipped a beat. First love, and now happiness, what a day this had turned out to be. She picked up her pace until she was sprinting and whipped behind the shack breathlessly, and there, on the post with a small string wrapped to its neck and right foot stuck in adhesive, was a 3-inch tall fairy struggling to remove the noose from its neck and its wings violently attempting to pull its leg out of the stick. It took a moment for the fairy to notice her there, but when it did it stopped its struggle, and a look of relief fell over its face. Guldara was shaking and gurning. The fairy pointed to its neck and tugged its leg in the adhesive to show her that it was stuck and squeaked something in Fey to her. "I can't understand you." She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a pair of scissors. The fairy stopped moving and took a moment to study her eyes, empty, and a smile slowly creeping up the corners of her mouth, and after a moment its eyes grew even wider and it began to struggle even harder than it had before, making tiny squeaks and grunts. As she stood over the fairy, its wings made an audible buzzing sound, its face twisted in fear and covered in tiny glistening pearls of tears, scratching its neck to glimmering and glinting purple blood to loosen the noose and vein. Guldara produced a small pouch from her vest pocket and pulled from it a piece of cotton. She used the scissors to cut a very small piece from the tuft, then placed the pouch back into her pocket. "Open your mouth." The fairy screamed as loud as its tiny lungs could muster, and Guldara shoved the cotton into its gaping mouth and used her magic to adhere its mouth closed, leaving a glossy film over its lips and the cotton protruding from its mouth. It choked and writhed and took in hyperventilating breaths through its nose. She snipped the scissors over its head and the string fell behind it, getting stuck in the right wing and preventing it from being able to flap. "Oh, perfect." Guldara snipped the wing from its backside, taking off a chunk of its back flesh along with it. The fairy screamed through the cotton in its mouth, and its left wing sputtered in bursts, while blood squirted from the veins that led to the right wing. She crouched and watched it cry, its face twisted in fear, watching it in earnest, but calculated study, as if trying to imagine how its little face is able to make shapes that look so similar to hers. The fairy clasped its hands together and squealed through its gag, pleading in the most mortal way it knew to do. She smiled, opened the scissors, and put the stuck leg in between the blades, and with a quick snip the fairy fell to its side, a muffled scream of agony as it pulled itself across the post, leaving a tiny streak of blood behind it as the adhesive turned to dust in its wake. Guldara was biting her bottom lip, excitedly shaking her head from side to side as she pulled a plastic baggie from the pocket on her vest. She used the scissors to poke several holes in the bag. As the fairy pulled itself to the edge of the table, doing anything to get away from its tormentor, it held out a hand to plead with her. She quickly snipped at the hand, intentionally missing, and let out a giddy chuckle as it instinctually pulled back. She picked up the fairy and used her middle finger to flick it against the head. For a moment, the fairy stopped struggling as it tried to regain its senses, dazed from the impact. She flicked it again, and its head flopped from side to side as blood began to form on its eyelid. It struggled to pick its head back up, slowly blinking. She flicked it again and it stopped moving entirely. Several hours later she was using a tiny set of tweezers to delicately remove the magus that acted as the creature's heart. The corpse of the man she had watched suffocate in front of her new pet was propped up on a makeshift operating chair that she had fashioned from wicker and branches, its eyes now permanently bulged from their sockets in a blank expression that was equal parts fear and wonder. His heart, she fed to her new pet, who took convincing but became malleable the more he drank of the manna. The chest and stomach had both been pulled from their proper place and were strewn about the room, still connected. The mess was a reminder to her why she had long before switched from elfins to the enchanted creatures that she now favored. A fey magus is easy to track through their translucent skin, often acting as the heart or lungs of the creature, replacing the biological component entirely, not to mention bursting with mana, whereas an elfin magus is fickle and hard to track without knowing where it started and offers paltry return on the effort. And not nearly as potent, of course. This one's magus was nestled into his spine, a tiny undulating tumor squirming as it mindlessly searched for its host, made of swirling blacks and shimmering cerulean that made a faint popping sound as it burst between her fingers and drained into the jar. When she had finished doing the same with the much smaller magus that she pulled from the fey, marveling as it drained 3 times as much as the elfins, she pulled the lid closed and placed the container next to the others, a multitude of colors looking back to her in a rainbow of containers each filled to the brim. She licked the excess from her finger, and her eyes became wide and wild in an instant, and the room trickled and took in every decrepit breath of death along with her. Her hand waved in front of her and left trails in the ether behind it. She held her hand to the ceiling and stuck to it with her magic, lifting her legs so that they were on the ceiling with her like a spider in heat, and in moments she was laughing hysterically and weeping uncontrollably while dangling from the ceiling. She locked eyes with her new pet and added growling to the laughter and tears. In the corner, Lark watched in horror as he held his stump of a hand tight against his chest, taking in labored breaths through his nose while his mouth burned and charred from the adhesive within it and without it, the acrid sting of mana on his defeated tongue and throat and covering his bloodied shirt. The room made a black fire, and an arachne demon emerged from hell commanding him to heal. Her aura is golden, shining like the sun. The mana fuels her dreams, and she is back at home and still a little girl. Not yet taken to the Apex's chamber, behind the undressed skeleton. Still unaware of curses and monsters, and unaware that she could become one herself with just a little time. The face is different than the one she stole, the one she killed her new pet's old friend with, and she doesn't like its crooked edges and sharp nose. There is a door in front of her with a mirror hanging on it, and the reflection is her own, fresh-faced and unmarked by the blade she turned on herself so long ago. From behind, his hand touches her shoulders, and his smile is crooked and yellow. She smashes the mirror, and the shards dig into her knuckles, and the blood that pools at her feet becomes a crimson key that fits the door. When she steps to the other side, she is older and has just collected the first of the mana, just drops in the first jar. In those days it was mainly cats and rodents dumb or curious enough to wander into her traps, as rudimentary as they were then. She greedily drank the glowing viscous fluid and the world turned into fire that she could touch and hold, and she could hear the mana that makes up all things speaking to her in an intimate whisper and holding her naked body close against its mighty and omnipotent bosom. And more than anything, she couldn't hear him anymore. His voice melted with the walls. And as she melts into the earth with her body and spirit content at last, she is suddenly aware of a distinct hollow feeling in her chest, and she takes in as deep of a breath as she can muster, but her lungs can't take in enough. She falls into that sensation, and she is now watching her body as it dangles from adhesive on the ceiling, inches away from her own face. She watches as the eyes pop open, and a thick black goo falls from the empty sockets and into her eagerly open maw. She crawls to her pet, and he opens his mouth to receive the vile slime, licking her mouth clean when the inside is drained. She closes her eyes and curls herself as tight as she can, weeping and laughing and growling as her rapidly deteriorating body hanging from the ceiling sloughs off to blanket her warm. Chapter 3. Meet Christian, a bard playing a masterful melody on his guitar and using phonetic magic to sound like 6 voices singing in harmony to a slew of enraptured party-goers, all swooning and tossing golden boulders into his hat. He finishes and his speaking voice melts their hearts as well. He pockets the coins and places his hat, lifts his instrument into the air by the neck, and with a whip of his hand the guitar turns into a slender and elegant rapier, which he sheathes with a wink and a smile. One of the women around him faints. A drunken partygoer sloshes into him and thanks him for the party, to which Christian says, "Of course, councilman, enjoy yourself." While he pats the councilman's arm with one hand, with the other he drops a small rune into the pocket of the drunken politician, with him none the wiser. He goes up the staircase to the balcony overlooking the party and pulls a tiny flute from his chest pocket. He unsheathes the dirge and plunges it into the ground in an exaggerated gesture, shocking the partygoers around him before he slightly bends the blade back and lets it go so that it reverberates in the ground, creating a droning tone throughout the room. He turns to a woman nearby and asks if she wouldn't mind holding his cigarette, then asks her, "Milady, do you know the words to Heart-Shaped Chest?" She nods excitedly, and he uses the droning of the blade as the foundation of the melody on his flute. He uses his foot to slide down the blade, changing the pitch and wowing partygoers as the effortless symphony waxes and wanes, the woman's voice amplified and distorted layers and layers thick in harmonies with his magic. The rune that he slipped into the councilman's pocket begins to hum in a matching reverberation to the dirge into a runed earpiece he had specially crafted by his man in Damar. As long as the dirge drones its song, Christian hears everything within a few meters of the rune, and he had slipped many runes into many pockets. He meets eyes with his brother Weston in the corner, who smirks as he feverishly writes down what he hears in his own earpiece. And in the crowd downstairs, the youngest brother, Chandler, whispers a quiet charm into the air that puts anyone who drank his wine into a more talkative and comfortable mood. Just before the song is over, Weston gives Christian a signal and he plays a final refrain, the room erupting into applause as he takes his bow from the balcony and kisses the woman on the cheek. Christian uses his hand to quiet the crowd. "Well, I'm no good at speeches and the lot, so I'll keep this short, and we can get back to the debauch." The room cheered. This may be the first of these parties here at the Red Castle, but rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, that this is far from the last. If you'll indulge me a moment, I'd like to especially thank our esteemed host this evening, your sixth ordained apex, the sanguine queen herself, Gwendolyn. A female in a beautiful and flowing red dress graciously floats from her place in the crowd and flies to be next to Christian before she bows and thanks the crowd and welcomes them into her home. "I think we're all just having such a wonderful time, don't you?" The room nodded and murmured in agreement to her. "I think, after all this time, tonight should show each and every one of you that you don't have to be scared of me anymore." Scattered applause and a few nervous coughs could be heard throughout the room. She smiled through grit teeth and leans to Christian, whispering into his ear, "Get to my office, now. And bring me what I want." Gwendolyn floats back down to the party to continue to mingle with guests, who take her in and excitedly crowd around her to get a chance to brush shoulders with such a famous and beautiful deity, while Christian sheathes the dirge with a deft whip of his hand and turns to walk up to the third and restricted floor, effortlessly slipping out of sight. Christian is taken back when he walks into the office to see that Gwendolyn is already there, sipping a glass of wine and staring into an ornate fireplace. He asks how she can already be here, to which she simply smirks and holds out her hand for Christian to place something in it. He produces the note Weston had written earlier and places it into her hand. She rips it open and scans the page before lifting her eyes to meet Christian's with a smile as she tosses him a heavy bag of clinking golden coins and shimmering multicolored stones. Christian replies to her smile with, "Honestly, I think Chandler prefers not having to pick pockets, got a soft heart and softer brain he does." He opens the bag and peeks inside of it, and bloody ells does it pay better too. "If I'd known you apex freaks were hurtin' this bad for me stock and trade, I imagine we wouldn't have been playin' clubs for pebbles and copper." Her eyes do not flinch, and she maintains her smile with him. "Anytime you need me and mine, you know where to find us, don't you, love?" She nods her head and tells him to go downstairs and enjoy the party. As he turns to leave the room, she looks back down to her expensive correspondence and whispers as she scans it once again, "Enjoy it while you can." Chapter 4. As other students funnel out of the classroom, Bria stays behind and waits to speak with Mother Morwen. When the classroom is empty except for just the two of them, she approaches the ancient woman and clears her throat. Mother Morwen makes a movement in acknowledgement to her, barely perceptible, and a voice appears in Bria's head asking if there was anything else that she needed. Bria tries to answer her, but is quickly interrupted by Mother Morwen's voice in her head saying, "Child, think. These ears just aren't what they used to be." Bria closes her eyes tight and thinks as hard as she can, and after a moment hears, "Ah, there you are, child. Thinking at last." Bria apologizes to Mother Morwen, then asks if she would mind showing her another one of her favorite places from the world above. Mother Morwen sighs and says that if she dies with any regrets, it would be that they robbed the college of the vistas he paints in the sky. She tells Bria to open her eyes, and when she does she is at the edge of a cliff overlooking the Meccan woods, the smell of rain holding fast and waiting until the right moment to fall, the crisp of the air against her cheeks, and just over the horizon, the bright shining light of Sengel's great red eye peeks to meet its gaze with hers, and just before it does, she is back in the classroom with the ancient crone, a tear running down her cheek. "It's beautiful," she says aloud, and instantly a voice in her head screams, "What?" To which she closes her eyes shut tight and thinks the same words as hard as she can. "Ah yes," says Mother Morwen in Bria's head, "but there is beauty still in the stone. Beauty that those above would find as wonderful and awe-inspiring as you find the ether. You take it for granted, and you don't know that you are, because it's all that you know. One day, you'll know more, and you'll appreciate it more. Go now, be young. And remember to think." Bria leaves the classroom and begins heading to her dorm room, but before she makes it there a group of students follow behind her and begin to heckle her. As they walk down the hall, they pass a tall male student who notices how uncomfortable the girl being picked on is. Once they get near a staircase, Bria is tripped and falls down the stairs, and the male student rushes behind to help her, the girls giggling and mocking the both of them for being orphaned and not having homes to go back to. The boy helps Bria to her feet, introducing himself as Sim, and once she stands, she notices that her front right tooth is chipped. Ouch, that must hurt. He offers to help her to her dorm room, which she agrees to, and as they walk he asks her if her parents died during the attack as well, to which she responds yes. He asks if she would be interested in him showing her something interesting, but makes her swear before he shows her to not tell anyone. They turn down a dusty and disheveled hallway, and at the end of it are a mass of spare chairs and tables being stored. He pushes a table out of the way, and Bria notices a painting now accessible and leaning against the wall, a headmaster's portrait from long, long ago, now adorned with doodles that gave the old man a nifty mustache. Sim moves the painting out of the way and reveals a hidden hallway behind it, and she reluctantly but curiously goes in before him. He follows behind her, then places the painting back to where it was, closes his eyes tight and lifts his hand toward the painting, and with a massive amount of effort she hears the table behind the painting skidding and screeching back into its proper place. He turns to her and breathlessly waves her on, saying that he'll be right behind her. She walks down the hallway and stands before a thick black curtain. When she reaches out to pull the curtain back, her hand instead goes right through the fabric like it wasn't there at all, and she pulls it back in shock before putting her whole arm through it and waving her hand on the other side. She sticks her head through the curtain and behind it sees a few dozen students, and even a few young professors drinking and laughing and loudly talking, as if they were celebrating some monumental victory. Sim walks through the curtain and pulls her through behind him, saying, "Pretty alright turnout for the time of day?" He walks ahead to the bar situated at the back of the room, surrounded by glistening and glowing light, with a bartender sporting a professor's robe behind the bar singing with masterful phonetic magic, literally lifting Bria's spirits with every passing second that she heard his beautiful harmonies. He gets the two of them a drink, and just as he hands it to her there's a shout heard from somewhere in the room, followed by a sound like meat slapping against meat, and the room began to cheer and ooh and crowd around two young mages with their fists up and ready for a fight. Bria stands on the bar to get a better look, and when she does a few students look to her and follow suit. One of the fighters threw a punch that whistled in the air as he struck, and a person behind the other fighter as he dodged out of the way was hit with an invisible force that sent him flying back. The room cheered and screamed for more. The fighters lunged at each other and Bria's heart fluttered as their fists made contact with each other's face and a spritz of blood flew across the room, but before the blood could splatter onto anyone or anything, it stopped in midair and instantly changed its direction, striking a fighter hard in the chest and sending him flying backwards as the other controlled the blood with his magus, trying his hardest to catch his breath, blood streaming down his face from a cut on his forehead. Bria looked to Sim with a quiet wonder in her eyes, and he gives her a silent nod in approval. Bria had, for years now, at least since she got word that her parents were gone, felt as though she was truly alone in this underground prison, no escape simply because there's nowhere to escape to. Not for her. For the first time, she felt like maybe she wasn't a prisoner at all, maybe here, she could actually be free. And now, with the man glued to the altar, Ren swung me through the air. For a moment, I could have wept from excitement to taste the sweet flesh of Alphen after so long deprived. But when I made contact with this flesh, it was not the flesh of Alphen, but the flesh of living death. disgusting and repulsive apex, notes of necrosis, and that unmistakable stench of wisdom. Harder to cut than the boy had thought it would be, not going all the way through, despite my perfect craftsmanship, the blame being his poor form. Ren must have felt my repulsion and began to dry heave. I felt the eyes of the apex look into mine, sensing me, not seeing, and a slow and twisted smile crept upon his face through his thick black beard. He demanded that Ren cut again, hard enough to cut through. Black blood dripping and steaming on the floor from the half-amputation, I felt that maddening authority of apex tongue drape over me, and the boy lifted his hand and brought me down once for both wrists. The apex never uttered a sound of pain, but as soon as the second arm fell free to his side he thrusted his stumped hands into the air and screamed a swear word as loud as he could, steam rising rapidly from the stumps until they were no longer bleeding but scarred over completely, and he continued to scream as if releasing some internal dam of anguish, the energy pooling at the new scarred over stumps and his muscles pulsing with power. The energy overflowed into his stumps and dripped onto the floor, sparking against the temple tile, and with every ounce of might the man let out a final surge of power and two tiny fingers popped out of the stumps, no bigger than a newborn's. The dust settled in the room. The man straightened up his body and cleared his throat, and after a moment of silence said, "Sorry, I've never had to regenerate before. I always thought it would just." Sim scans the man up and down as he swoons from side to side and looks down at his fingers with a disappointed and defeated look on his face, and says to him, "Lord help us, what are you?" The man shifts his shoulders and uses his two steadily growing fingers to straighten his exceptionally crafted tunic. He strikes a pose and says with a full chest that he is Unde the Visionary, 8th ordained apex, and then in a flash a gleaming golden staff appears just in front of him, and he reaches out to grab it, but it instead drops to the ground, as he has no hands. He turns to Bria and says, "Sorry my love, I'm usually much better at being cool. I just haven't moved my legs in a very long time and He stumbles off of the altar, his head swooning, and takes a step off and instead falls directly onto his face. The team look at each other in silence, and after a moment hear the man snoring. "He tried so hard to push that magic that he passed out," said Ren. "I've definitely been there." Sim snaps his head to Bria and says that they can't stay here, and that they can't get involved with an apex. Bria ignores him and asks Ren how he got a UN weapon. Sim pauses for a moment and looks at Ren, who wordlessly stared at the ground, then looks at me in Ren's hand. "Bria," he says, "Bria, we have to go. We can't get involved with an apex or someone who wants to be one." He turns his head to Ren. "No offense," he said, "I know you probably didn't choose that thing but, well, it makes sense that you were trying to sleep in the Meccan woods. You've got a death wish, and you can't help it, and that's very sad for you, but I have to protect her." He goes to Bria and grabs her hand, but she pulls it away. Sim steps to her, and she puts out her hand to silence him and lets out a sigh of frustration. "Look around you. No, really. Look at where we are." The room glistens with blues, purples and greens from the stained glass above, and a giant backdrop hangs behind them of a man hanging from a cross, blood dripping down his face from a crown of thorns placed on his head. For us to end up here, of all places, after everything. You prayed for a sign, Sim, and he's screaming one at us. But he's one of them, Bria. They don't think like we do. They've already lost anything they had to lose. If we miss this boat, that's our chance. He squeezes her hand tight. "Fugitives, Bria. Unless we leave. Now." She jerks her hand away from his. "The way I see it, we need all the help we can get. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we're dead if they catch us, and if it hadn't been for that ward, we would have been caught." She lets out another sigh. "I know you're trying to protect us. I think that's what these two are for. You need protection too, and I'm not strong enough. Not compared to." She looks at Ren, then down at the snoring man with two tiny pulsating fingers steadily growing from the stumps. "I can't think of anyone who would be able to protect us better than our country's literal protectors." Sim furrows his brow and bows his head. "Besides," she says, "no one is getting out of here if I don't sleep." I can't remember the last time I slept. Are you hurting? No, I need to rest. And to think. All this time, Ren played with me between his fingers and stared deep into the intricate tile of the temple floor, the words that Sim had just said echoing in his mind. As the conversation between the two continued, he looked at them and something formed inside of him. Something that wasn't there before, and certainly was never in that putrid husk of a father he had. As Ren looked at the two of them, one thing was very clear to him, and it began to form in my mind as well. When was the last time he felt like he was this close to anyone at all? So often their mortal desires are so mundane. The boy desired the haste, yes, to numb as the mortals often do, and I happily encouraged that desire as is my wont for him to do so. He sneaks off now, and drinks more while the two bicker, taking care that they don't see him swig the swill down. After his father, when I tempted the boy with power, when so many before him had accepted eternity at a simple whisper and I showed him floods, he showed no desire. But in him now I see a void begging to be filled in silent torment. A void that could be filled by so many different things, and I can be so many different things. Chapter 5. When Unde wakes up, he is on the back of a cart with the smell of manure in the air. It is the smell, in fact, that wakes him. He smacks his mouth and looks around to see Ren, Bria, and Sim bouncing on the back of the cart as well. He looks at his hands, and they are almost entirely grown back, if not 5 sizes too small, except for 2 perfect pinky fingers. He uses his elbows to pick himself up and leans on the opposite side of the cart with an exaggerated grunt, facing them. He clears his throat and asks them where they are. Bria glares at him. He kicks Ren's shin and says that he asked them a question. And now he's back to kicking, said Sim. Unde shifted his gaze to meet his and asks where they are again. You asked us that 45 minutes ago, said Ren. You kicked me, last time, Sim said. After I told you where we were. You kick any of us again, and I'm taking the leg and dropping you and letting you crawl to wherever you want to get to so bad while it grows back. Unde waved his hand in Sim's direction. Yeah, I'm not talking to you, Twirly. I'm talking to the one with a future. He looked at Bria and narrowed his eyes, and if the broad doesn't stop looking at me like that, I'm gonna crack her skull open. Sim reached for his dagger, and Bria stopped him. We could have left you in the temple, you know, she said to Unde. And deprive yourself of my company? Shame at the thought. The cart shook as it went over a hole in the road, and the old man driving turned to them and said something that sounded like, and forgive me for my interpretation, Sabada, damn near whole pot in a road. He laughed and pulled a bag of honeyweed from his front pocket and began rolling it between a small piece of paper he pulled from a pack in the bag. Roll me one of those, old man. No, quickly interrupted Sim, you aren't smoking anything else until we get what you owe us. Last time you passed out, and now we're having to explain this to you. Again. Unde let out a hearty and facetious laugh. Oh, you? For what? You'd still be stuck in that temple if Ren hadn't cut you out, said Bria. You'd still be stuck in that hole if I hadn't lifted you out. You'd be walking if this old man didn't let us ride in his cart. From my count, you owe all of us each at least one favor. Thanks for that, by the way. He took in a deep breath, taking in the stink around him. Sim made a disgusted face. I think that any apex who needs as much help as you to just get from one place to another should feel a little more accountability for taking advantage of the less fortunate. Unde grit his teeth and hit the back of his head on the side of the cart behind him without saying a word, looking up at the tree line slowly passing above. The cart driver heard the sound and took it to be a signal for the cigarette he had rolled, which Ren instead snatched from him and placed between his lips. Bria gave him a sideways glance, to which he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Smells better than anything else around us right now." "Hardly," said Sim, waving the smoke from his face. Unday grumbled, "Fine. If you tell me where we are, we'll call that an even exchange." "Need I remind you that you'd be still stuck in?" "Yeah, I don't give a shit about that. Guldara's magic muck may have kept me there for a while, but it wouldn't have lasted forever. I'd have eventually found a way out of the underground. I'd have eventually made it to Luster by walking. And I could have done all of that." He glared into Bria's eyes. "I could have done all of that, because unlike you and Twirly, I have the time." He reached out his tiny hand and snatched the cigarette from Ren's mouth. "You tell me where we are, and you get your favor. Because I have the time and you're wasting it." He took in a deep drag of the cigarette, the red-hot tip slowly bearing down to the nub onto his tiny little fingers. "And I'm an apex, and as far as you underground simpletons know, that makes me suzerain of anything under the ether, but little do you underground simpletons know that I'm also a really good guy who wants to do you a favor, out of his own goodwill. Even if you're wasting his time." Sim piped up, "We were on an actual shuttle cart headed to Imps Down, before you kicked me and told us you needed to get to Luster. So that's where we're headed now. Hence, shit cart." Ren shook his head, "Finally going to Luster, and I'm gonna smell like pig poop." "Ain't pig, lil boyo, that's big bird. Cockatrice shit." "Great." Unday smirked, and Ren felt a chill go down his spine. The apex used his tiny hands to hoist himself up to his feet and looked ahead at the road yet traveled. "You can't hide for much longer." "I'm coming for." The cart hit another pothole, and Unday fell backward onto the road, hitting his head. Bria sighed and lifted his unconscious body back onto the cart, placing him directly onto the pile of manure so that he sank in just a bit as she placed him down. The cart driver turned his head and made a face. "That's nasty," he said, turning back and shaking his head. The cart is stopped by a man in the road, who asks for help as the cart that his family was riding on has broken down. Ren and Sim spring to help, but Bria is hesitant. Once they're off the cart, the needy man pulled a blade on Sim's neck, and a group of bandits fell out from the hills and trees around them. An arrow flies through the air and enters the right temple of the cart driver, who simply slumped over and never moved again. One of them, carrying a billy club, marched up to Ren and lifted the club, watching as it hit him between the eyes. Everything goes black. When Ren wakes up, Bria is next to him and still unconscious, and Sim is standing over them breathing heavily and covered in blood. He picks himself up and sees that 5 bandits around them are dead, their insides spilled out of their mouths, and eyes bulging from their sockets. A bandit dropped his bow just at that moment and tried to run away, but Sim lifted his palm up like he was holding an invisible and heavy weight, and with a grunt of effort the bandit stopped moving and turned to him, begging him not to do it before one of his eyes exploded in their sockets, the other bulging out. And when Sim closed his hand, the man vomited and choked on organs forcefully ejected from his mouth. Sim rushed to Bria and shook her, screaming for her to wake up, and when she opens her eyes, he begins to weep and holds her tight in his arms. A choking sound comes from the back of the cart, followed by a grunt. Unday picked himself up with his tiny hands, slightly bigger now, and asks why he's lying in shit. He jumps down from the cart and surveys the scene before him, 6 bandits, gored around them. A smile creeps across his face, and he turns his head to Ren, a blood mage. "Huh." He slaps Ren on the shoulder. "I was worried you were just, this. But a blood mage? What an apex you'll make. Gonna give old Gwynny a run for her stones, ain't ya, half-chop?" Sim slung his hand and sloshed blood from his robes. "Yeah, Ren, couldn't have done it without you." He gave Bria a look. Ren's face turned red. He shoved Unday's hand off of his shoulder. "I'm not gonna be an apex. It's been 8 years, and I haven't even figured out how summoning works." Unday made a sound with his lips. "You'll figure it out after the 4th or 5th time you're able to make your way back." Ren narrowed his eyes. Make my way back? Unde's mouth creeped into his toothy yellow smile. Anyway, you two learned scholars make yourselves useful and put these flogged down corpses into the cart. If we're on the road to Luster, there's a rotting hull not much further down. Sim was still catching his breath and wiping blood from his face. Now? Unde demanded. Bria rolled her eyes and, still sitting on the ground, lifted her hands into the air, and the bodies slowly lifted one by one into the cart. When the last body thudded onto the others, she dropped her hands and took in a deep gasping breath, and a steady stream of blood began to pour out of her nose. I think I might have a concussion. Ren turned to her and began to put his hand on her head to heal her, but Unde said, later, we have to drop these at the hull, before the curse sets in. Ren looked at her, and she blinked at him. His hand was hovering over her head. After a moment she shook her head and pushed his hand away. I'm fine, let's just go. Unde put his forearm against the neck of the cart driver and pulled him to the back of the cart, opening the man's jacket once he was on top of the bandits and pulling the bag of honeyweed from it. He closed the man's jacket, and a glimmer caught his eye from the gore underneath. He nudged the driver out of the way and saw a tiny gleaming chunk of magus nestled in the exposed throat of one of the bandits. He peeked his head back and saw Ren and Sim helping Bria to her feet, and reached his tiny hand into the gore and pulled the magus from it, jerking it free from the muscle and tissue that surrounded it, and put it in his pocket. Get in the seat up here with me, half-chop. He gestured Ren towards the front of the cart with his head. You know how to drive one of these? Ren nodded. My dad had one, used to drive it to work. Good. He turned up his nose towards Sim, who was helping Bria onto the back of the cart. Hurry up you two, or you're gonna have to get saved again. He kicked the cart and the bodies jiggled like firm gelatin, and he chuckled to himself, unless you want to join them, that is. Your future awaits. He laughed as he struggled to find a way to lift himself onto the cart seat with his tiny hands. Every bump in the road felt to Ren like the cart would topple and break. It creaked and shuddered with every rotation of the wheels as though held together with pure spirit and will, an unending need to survive past its time. The stick shift stuck with every push of the clutch and fought him to move into the next gear. Over the grinding of vintage enchantments whirring from the front, Ren could hear Sim and Bria quietly arguing again in the back, her quiet and soft voice barely cutting through. How much desire the boy had to hear them, to join them. I was salivating. Show me the dagger, Unde said. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead. Ren sighed and shifted gears. Why? Why? Unde repeated in a mocking tone, show me the flogging dagger. No, I thought. But the authority overwhelmed and he pulled me from my scabbard and kept his grip tight around my handle. Unde yanked me from his hands and I screamed in rage, so angry I could have bitten the boy in half, furious enough to forget myself. In the next moment I was out of his hands and back into Ren's. The disgusting and fat apex had tricked the stupid boy into summoning me. Sheesh, Unde grumbled, that one really doesn't like me for some reason. Ren's eyes were wide, and a grin slapped onto his face, and Unde met the smile with one of his own. Remember that sensation. Most of what we do is that sensation, just to different degrees. Ren flipped me into the air and instantly summoned me back into his hand. I hate that feeling. I will never forgive that fat apex for rushing my finely tuned process. Wait, Ren said to him, then it's like using your magus? It felt like that, but from, I don't know, somewhere else? Kind of. It just comes more naturally. No side effects to making the magic happen. Ren's eyes looked into his with wonder and Unde's mouth twisted. That's what makes us kings, kid. Ren laughed. Oh, kings, huh? You do realize we found you tied up in a room of corpses, right? Royally adhered to an altar half-chop. When you're a king, even your low points are royal. They pulled over onto the side of the path at Unde's word, jerking to a stop. Ren immediately rushed to Bria's side and placed his hand on her head, and after a flash of blue light from his palm, he turned his head to vomit. She giggled and thanked him, and he helped her from the cart as Sim began to pull the cart driver's body from the back. It took them around half an hour to load the bodies into the rotting hull, and the blind Senegalese priest at the entrance hung his head low as Ren and Sim made several trips to and from the cart. Ren had only been to a rotting hull once and hated the smell. Like it was too clean, even though it only knows death and decay. Once all the bodies were loaded in, the priest closed the door behind them and began to pray. As he prayed, his eyes burned hot and orange and red, and from a sliver in the door Ren could just see a faint glowing green light coming from within, the priest forcing the bodies to rot so that the mages can't fester and curse. And the smell, fragrant and too clean. The wrong smell for death. The suzerain moon peeked its eye through the clouds. A rest area had been made for those coming to mourn the passing of their loved just off of the path, and Sim suggested resting for the night. Ren pulled the loaves of bread from his pack and handed one of them to Sim, who tore it in half and gave the other half to Bria. Unday snatched the pack and rummaged through it, pulling out a log of dried sausage and chomping into it. His tiny hands made it look massive. He tossed the pack back down to Ren. Within a half hour, Sim was snoring loudly and Unday was loudly talking to the Senegalese priest at the hall, the two of them passing a carafe of wine back and forth and becoming increasingly more obnoxious as the night progressed. Bria sat in front of the fire, her legs pulled up to her chest. Ren sat across from her and stared into the flames. "You can sit next to me, if you want. I don't bite." Bria was smiling at him and patted the area next to her. "Oh sure." He picked himself up and plopped down next to her. The fire crackled, and Unday's boisterous laugh muffled some distance away. "So," Bria said, "you never did tell me how you got a UN weapon." Ren scrunched a corner of his mouth. "It was my dad's." "Oh." "He never became an apex. In case you were, I don't know, wondering." "I kind of figured, since you have his dagger." "Actually, the last time I was at a rotting hull was for..." He stopped and looked at her, her eyes meeting his. Her face fell into his and her lips touched his own. His eyes could have popped from their sockets. She pulled her lips back ever so slightly, then placed another one onto him. Then another, longer this time, her lips slightly looser than before. "Thanks for helping me earlier, Ren. You're a good guy." Ren shook his head, glancing back to Sim. "No, I don't think I am." Her eyes narrowed for a moment, like she hadn't expected him to say that, then she smirked. "Maybe not. But who is?" She leaned in again and gave him another soft and wet kiss. "Get some sleep, half-chop. No telling what that crazy idiot is going to have us do for him in Luster." Ren tried to sleep, but couldn't. Sim's every snore was a knife flying through the air, aimed for his head. His face was hot and red. And when he finally did fall into sleep, I stood over him and smelled, deep, the scent of desire. Chapter 6. When the team wake up, Unday is running around the rotting hull, doing laps fast enough that dust is flying. A steady thump comes from somewhere nearby. His hands are now fully grown. Once he sees that they are awake, Unday excitedly shows them that he has regained the use of his powers by taking them around the corner where the Senegalese priest is beating his head against the side of the rotting hull, a thick string of blood and skull sticking and pulling with every thunk of his head against the wall. Sim whips around to Unday, who thrusts both hands forward and takes his and Bria's heads into his hands, their knees giving out and their eyes rolling into the back of their heads. Ren fumbles to pull me from my scabbard before pulling me on the fat brute, who knocked me from his hand, and I stuck instead into the soft ground before the apex put his hands on Ren's head as well. Instantly the floor dropped out under his feet, and he is hovering in the ether of a dark corridor adorned with silver and gold chandeliers and lamps, walled with extravagant and enormous paintings, each of the same woman in various stages of undress. In the next moment, he blinks his eyes, and he is now looking through someone else's, a drunken stupor filling his mind, stumbling down the marbled pearl hallway, sloshing his drink against the paintings. In the reflection of the silver, he picks at his teeth, and he sees the reflection of a younger and clean-shaven Unde. He pulls one of the paintings aside and reveals a hidden chamber. A young girl is there, her eyes turned white. Unde places his hand on her head and her eyes slowly fill back to their normal hue, and she instantly begins sobbing and begging him to stop showing her these horrible things. Unde asks if she has learned her lesson and she screams that she has, but he says that he doesn't believe her and puts his hand back to her head, her eyes turning the same vacant white and her face draining of color. He sighs and slaps the girl across the face before laughing to himself and turning to leave the hidden chamber. In the next moment, he feels a sharp pain in his side and looks down to see a hole blown out of his ribcage. He falls to his knees, and the girl's magus glows on the back of her neck, her eyes still rolled into her head and drained of color. She screams when she meets his eyes and lifts her finger and with a flash of sickening green light fires a projectile directly at his head. When Ren, Sim and Bria are pulled out of the vision, screaming and holding their sides from pain, Unde is sitting at the fire staring at them with a snarl on his face. Guldara. He says, you help me get Guldara, and I'll owe you. I'll be your bodyguard till then, too. No stones, no boulders. Just goodwill towards Elfenkind, right? He spits and gives them one of his toothy smiles, even more unsettling with his wide and wild eyes. I told you, I'm a really good guy. He vigorously shook his leg with anticipation. Oh no, Ren bolted to his pack and opened it, digging through it and pulling spare clothes and food onto the ground. No, 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 no. What's the issue? Sim was glaring at Unde and rubbing the back of his head. Ren whipped his head toward Unde. Where is it? Did you really take all of it, you crazy piece of... Ren. Bria's brow was furrowed and eyes wide, her arms out and palms turned up. Ren swore loudly and threw his pack into the woods. He drank all my haste. Sim lifted an eyebrow. Haste? Bria shrugged. Unde was laughing to himself and nodding his head. Well, not exactly. He pulled a vial from his pocket and turned it upside down over his tongue, letting the thick slime slide down his throat. He burped. Now, that yellow smile. Now, I drank all your haste. Ren lunged at him, but in the next moment Unde was already behind him, and in a flash of gold he pulled his gleaming Yuan staff from the ether and thrust it into Ren's backside, knocking him onto his face and taking his breath away. Bria jumped to her feet and ran to him, and Unde turned his staff towards Sim, who was holding his dagger to his palm at the ready. Unde narrowed his eyes to him. Shoddy job with the bandits, by the way, twirly. He glanced his eyes down to Sim's dagger. Blood magic at the college. What must the headmaster think? Unde gave him a sickening smile. Sim's face turned red and hot, and he glared at him. Ren took in a deep breath and screamed, enough. He wheezed, taking in more air, and nodded his head to Bria, in thanks, who gave him a concerned smile and helped him to his feet. He closed his eyes tight and held out his hand, and I vanished from being stuck in the soft ground to being in his hand, pointed at the fat apex. Unde lifted his hands in surrender, and the staff vanished again into the ether. Bria stood next to him and asked Sim if he was okay, who was still glaring into the side of Unde's turned head. Then she asked, so this Guldara person, we help you find her, and you'll help me and Sim off of Kalta? Unde let out a boisterous laugh. Off of Kalta? That's seriously what you want me to do for you. I could make you a duke in El Mecca, you know that, right? Where could you want to be other than the greatest country on Emzin? We don't want to go to El Mecca, said Sim, who stood next to Bria and grabbed her hand. We're trying to get to Hyperia. She nodded her head in agreement with eyes of determination. Ren held his chest for breath and looked down at their clasped hands. His lips tingled. His face got hot, and he quickly looked away. The smile that Unde wore slowly began to drift downward until it turned into a scowl that seemed to fit his face much better. To answer your question, he shifted his gaze from Sim to Bria. No, I don't need your help finding Guldara. I need your help getting her. I know where she is, but I can't get to her. She won't let me. Sim scoffed. What would that little girl possibly be able to do to stop you? Unde's smile returned. Twirly, that was 200 years ago. She's not a little girl anymore. Okay then, what could that old and most likely very feeble woman possibly do to stop you, an apex, from getting her? Unde snarled and grumbled something under his breath as he reached into his coat pocket. After a moment, he pulled what looked like an oversized raisin from it and gave it a squeeze between his fingers. This is why. Agitated from the squeezing, it began to faintly glow a swirling blue. Ren covered his mouth and tried not to throw up, but was unable to stop it and ran to a tree. Sim and Bria exchanged perplexed glances. She's keeping you away with a magus? Sim was trying to understand, almost finding it amusing. No, she's eating them. Bria gagged and Ren threw up again. Sim scrunched his nose. Why? I don't know, she's just crazy. Being locked behind a skeleton painting tends to do that. So, you've been chasing some girl who escaped from your torture dungeon? Am I getting that right? Unde let out a frustrated grunt. No. I told you what I need, and my time is valuable. You either agree to the contract here and now, or I make my way to Luster on my own without you. And when I find Guldara, I rain holy retribution onto her with 2 UN weapons, me and the kid. I need you 2 sheltered geniuses, like I need another ass cheek, but I have a feeling he won't come with me if you 2 don't. Bria and Sim looked at Ren, who gave them a slight shrug and shy agreement as he wiped the vomit from his mouth, then exchanged a glance with each other. Bria, please, Sim pleaded, we aren't going to get another out here. Are we really going to go on an Apex's sick flogging death hunt? Bria shook her head, closed her eyes, then turned to Unde. Fine, you have a deal. Unde clapped his hands together. That's what I'm talking about. He wiped the sweat pouring from his forehead and grinded his teeth together, Ren filled with a new anger as his throat began to itch. The apex came up behind him and slapped him on the back. Sorry about the draft, kid, but good news. He wrapped his arm around Ren's neck and pulled him in close. Where we're going, they got things that'll really make you go fast. He lifted his eyebrows in a suggestive gesture. Ren gritted his teeth. He loudly laughed and yelled, Gather up the things, ye lowly scholarly types, we have a city to debaucher. He pulled his golden staff from the ether and began to twirl it between his fingers, making a whistling drone as it spun that he whistled along with himself, a beautiful and practiced melody. He made a springing jaunt to the cart. Bria and Sim turned to see Ren already digging his way through the brush to find the pack he threw and began to help him collect their things. In the distance, a steady thud continued to thump. Chapter 7. Guldara can feel him. He has returned. Escaped from her stick, somehow and some way. No matter, she thinks, for this is what she has planned for. She sends her ever-obedient pet out to lead Unde to her, his long white beard stained yellow and red from horrors unseen, and her pet agrees and thanks her. She goes to her shelf and pulls a jar of mana from it and begins to pour the mana into a huge tub, greedily drinking from each jar as she does so. As she pours, she sings a nursery rhyme. Oh Lily, so pretty to see. With cunning and guile, she'd surely break free. In darkness she was, but soon, she'd find light. Escaping the monster and taking her flight. A great monster's captive and caged in its den. Such monsters can't know such little girls' plans. She sang and she smiled, and she seemed to obey. But in her mind plotted, by night and by day. Oh Lily, so pretty to see. With cunning and guile, she'd surely break free. In darkness she was, but soon she'd find light. Escaping the monster and taking her flight. Her escape was so quick, she was shadow's swift glide. The monster was raging, but she's learned to hide. Oh Lily, so strong and so sure. Now finally free, and she's hungry for more. Oh Lily, so pretty to see. With cunning and guile, she's finally free. In darkness she was, so she made her own light. Escaping the monster and taking her flight. She searched for a magic and mystical spell. And when she transformed, the great monster fell. Oh Lily, with a single great bite. Oh Lily, the queen of the night. End of Act 1.
Okay. So, let's make sure it's still recording. Yes. Okay, perfect. Wow. Yeah, so thanks for listening, guys, if you have made it this far in. Again, what I'm looking for here, I know this is a horrible recording, and I'm so sorry. I will, as soon as I am possibly able to, I will get you something better to listen to. We've just had so many problems with trying to find, quick ways to post, really. Because I need notes so badly. I want to continue writing, and I just want to know if I'm onto something or not. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening. If you've listened to this far in, please comment, please like this, please subscribe. I thank you guys. if you've listened to this all the way through, then I can't thank you enough. I love you all. God bless. I hope you have a fantastic, it's Christmas time right now. I don't know when you're listening to this, but I hope you have a great Christmas. I hope, just know that I love you, and, please, I know I've said it in previous videos and stuff, but, let me know what you think here, and please, leave a comment if you need prayer or anything like that. Me and Kaylee will definitely pray for you. Anyway, we love you guys. Be safe, stay healthy, and yeah, God bless. All right, bye.